Sarah Martinez never imagined that her quiet job as a data analyst at Fort Braxton would turn into a life-or-death battle that would make international headlines. She was just another civilian contractor, someone who processed intelligence reports from the safety of an air-conditioned office while real soldiers faced danger overseas. But on a cold Tuesday morning in November, when armed militants breached the base's perimeter during a coordinated attack, Sarah found herself trapped in Building C with nowhere to run. What happened next would shock military experts worldwide. A woman with no combat training, armed with nothing but her intelligence and determination, would single-handedly eliminate 20 enemy combatants using only the resources she could find around her. This is the true story of how an ordinary civilian became an unlikely hero, proving that courage doesn't always wear a uniform. The events that unfolded over the next 6 hours would forever change how the military views civilian personnel and redefine what it means to be a defender of freedom. This is Sarah's story. Raw, unfiltered, and absolutely true. Sarah Martinez arrived at Fort Braxton at exactly 7:30 in the morning, just like she had every weekday for the past 3 years. The security guard at the main gate, Sergeant Johnson, waved her through with his usual friendly smile. Sarah parked her blue Honda Civic in the civilian contractor lot and walked the familiar path to Building C, her heels clicking against the concrete walkway. At 28 years old, Sarah was considered one of the most skilled data analysts on the base. She had graduated from Stanford with a degree in computer science and had been recruited by the Department of Defense straight out of college. Her job involved analyzing intelligence reports, tracking communication patterns, and identifying potential threats before they could materialize into real dangers. The morning started like any other. Sarah settled into her cubicle on the 3rd floor, turned on her computer, and began reviewing the overnight intelligence briefs. Her workspace was neat and organized, with family photos arranged carefully next to her monitor. There was one of her parents at their anniversary dinner, another of her college friends at graduation, and a recent selfie with her boyfriend Jake taken during their weekend trip to the mountains. Her supervisor, Dr. Rebecca Chen, stopped by around 9 o'clock to discuss the latest assignments. Dr. Chen was a former CIA analyst who had transitioned to civilian contracting after 20 years of government service. She was tough but fair and had become something of a mentor to Sarah over the years. "We've got some interesting chatter coming out of Eastern Europe," Chen said, placing a thick folder on Sarah's desk. "I need you to run pattern analysis on these communications. Look for anything that might suggest coordinated activity." Sarah nodded and opened the folder. Inside were dozens of intercepted messages, phone transcripts, and digital communications. This type of work was right in her wheelhouse. She had developed a reputation for spotting patterns that others missed, connecting seemingly random pieces of information to reveal larger pictures. The morning progressed normally. Sarah worked through her analysis, occasionally chatting with her colleague Marcus Rodriguez at the next cubicle. Marcus was a former Army sergeant who had transitioned to civilian work after completing his military service. He often shared stories about his deployments overseas, giving Sarah insights into the real-world implications of the intelligence they processed. "You know, Sarah," Marcus said during their coffee break, "sometimes I think you civilian analysts understand the big picture better than we did when we were in the field. You see patterns we missed because we were too focused on staying alive." Sarah laughed. "Well, it's easier to see patterns when you're not being shot at." Neither of them realized how prophetic those words would prove to be. Around 10:45, Sarah was deep in her analysis when she noticed something unusual in the communication patterns. There was a series of coded messages that seemed to reference specific locations and times. The language was carefully constructed to appear innocuous, but Sarah's trained eye caught the underlying structure. She pulled up satellite imagery and cross-referenced the coded locations with known military installations. Her heart started beating faster as she realized what she was looking at. The pattern suggested a coordinated attack on multiple targets, with Fort Braxton listed as a primary objective. Sarah immediately called Dr. Chen over to review her findings. Together, they spent the next 20 minutes verifying the analysis and confirming the threat assessment. Dr. Chen's face grew increasingly grave as she understood the implications. "Sarah, I need you to compile this into an immediate threat briefing," Dr. Chen said urgently. "I'm calling Colonel Williams right now. This needs to go up the chain of command immediately." Sarah's fingers flew across the keyboard as she prepared the briefing document. She had worked on threat assessments before, but never one with such immediate and local implications. The coded messages suggested the attack would happen within hours, possibly that very day. As she worked, Sarah noticed more details in the intercepted communications. The attackers had clearly spent months planning this operation. They had detailed floor plans of several buildings on the base, including Building C where she was currently sitting. They knew about shift changes, security protocols, and even the locations of civilian contractor workspaces. Doctor! Chen finished her phone call and hurried back to Sarah's desk. Colonel Williams wants to see this briefing in his office in 15 minutes, she said. He's already putting the base on elevated alert status. Sarah printed out the briefing materials and gathered all the supporting documentation. As she and Dr. Chen prepared to leave for the colonel's office, Sarah couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. The timing of her discovery seemed almost too convenient. If the attackers had been planning this for months, why would they allow their communications to be intercepted just hours before the attack? Dr. Chen, Sarah said as they walked toward the elevator. What if this is intentional? What if they wanted us to find these communications? Chen paused, considering the possibility. You mean as a distraction? Or to trigger a specific response? Sarah replied. If they know our protocols as well as these messages suggest, they would know that discovering an imminent threat would cause us to implement certain security measures. What if those measures are exactly what they want? Before Dr. Co-op Chen could respond, the building's emergency alarm system activated. The piercing sound of the alert siren filled the corridors as red lights began flashing throughout the building. An automated voice began repeating an announcement over the public address system. Attention all personnel. This is not a drill. The base is under attack. All civilian personnel are to remain in place and await further instructions. Military personnel report to designated defensive positions immediately. Sarah and Dr. Chen exchanged worried glances. Through the third-floor window, they could see smoke rising from the direction of the main gate. In the distance, the sound of gunfire was becoming increasingly audible. So much for getting this briefing to Colonel Williams, Dr. Chen said grimly. Looks like the attack is already underway. Sarah's mind was racing. If her analysis was correct, the attackers had detailed knowledge of the building's layout. They would know exactly where the civilian contractors worked, and they would know that standard protocol required civilians to remain in place during an attack. Dr. Chen, I think we're sitting ducks up here, Sarah said urgently. If they have the building plans, I think they do, they'll know exactly where to find us. Chen was already moving toward the emergency supply cabinet. She pulled out two-way radios and handed one to Sarah. You're right, we need to get out of this area. The emergency protocols assume external threats, not infiltration. The sound of gunfire was getting closer now, and Sarah could hear what sounded like explosions coming from the lower floors of their own building. Her heart was pounding, but her analytical mind was still working. She thought about the building's layout, the security measures, and the most likely routes an attacking force would take. The main stairwells will be compromised first, Sarah said, surprising herself with how calm her voice sounded. But there's an old service elevator in the back section that connects to the maintenance tunnels. If we can get to the basement level, we might be able to move between buildings undetected. Dr. Chen nodded approvingly. Good thinking. Grab whatever equipment you can carry. We need to assume we won't be coming back to this office anytime soon. Sarah quickly gathered her laptop, the printed threat briefings, and a backup drive containing all her recent analysis work. She also grabbed a small toolkit that Marcus had left on his desk, thinking that any tools might prove useful in an emergency situation. As they moved carefully through the office area toward the back section of the building, Sarah could hear boots on the stairwells and voices speaking in what sounded like a foreign language. The attackers were already inside the building, and they were moving systematically through each floor. The service elevator was an old, slow-moving freight lift that was rarely used except for maintenance purposes. As they waited for it to arrive, Sarah and Dr. Relaxa, Chen could hear the attackers getting closer. There were shouts and the sound of doors being kicked in as the militants searched each office. Come on, Dr. Chen whispered as the elevator slowly made its way up to the third floor. Finally, the doors opened with a mechanical clang that seemed impossibly loud in the tense silence. Sarah and Dr. Chen stepped inside just as they heard footsteps approaching their end of the corridor. The elevator began its slow descent as the sounds of the surge grew fainter above them. Sarah, Dr. Chen said quietly, I need you to know something. If we get separated, your analysis work is crucial. The information you discovered today could be the key to understanding this entire operation. Whatever happens, you need to get that data to Colonel Williams or someone in command. Sarah nodded, understanding the weight of responsibility that was now resting on her shoulders. She had gone from being a routine data analyst to potentially holding information that could save lives and help end this attack. The elevator reached the basement level with a shuddering stop. The doors opened to reveal a dimly lit maintenance area filled with pipes, electrical panels, and storage equipment. The space was larger than Sarah had expected, with several corridors leading off in different directions. Dr. Chen consulted a small maintenance map posted on the wall. According to this, we can access the tunnel system through that corridor, she said, pointing to a narrow passageway lined with utility pipes. As they moved deeper into the basement, Sarah began to understand the full scope of what they were dealing with. The attackers weren't just conducting a random assault on the base. They had planned this operation with military precision, and they clearly had access to detailed intelligence about the facility's layout and defensive procedures. The maintenance tunnels were narrow and poorly lit, but they provided a hidden route between buildings that the attackers might not know about. Sarah and Dr. Chen moved carefully through the underground passages, using their flashlights sparingly to avoid detection. After what felt like hours but was probably only 20 minutes, they reached an access point that led to the basement of the administrative building where Colonel Williams had his office. Dr. Chen tried her radio to contact base security, but there was only static in response. Either the attackers are jamming communications or our people are too busy fighting to respond, Dr. Chen said grimly. They climbed a maintenance ladder that led to a storage room in the administrative building's basement. From there, they could hear the sounds of battle raging throughout the base. Explosions, gunfire, and shouting voices created a chaotic symphony that reminded Sarah this was no longer the safe, quiet workplace she had known for 3 years. As they prepared to make their way to Colonel Williams's office, Sarah realized that her analytical skills were going to be put to a very different kind of test. Instead of studying patterns in intercepted communications, she was now trying to predict the movements and strategies of armed militants who were actively hunting for people like her. The woman who had arrived at work that morning as a routine data analyst was gone. In her place was someone who would need to think like a tactician, move like a soldier, and fight like a survivor. Sarah didn't know it yet, but she was about to discover capabilities within herself that would shock everyone who knew her, including herself. The real test was just beginning. Sarah and Dr. Chen moved carefully through the basement corridors of the administrative building, their footsteps echoing softly against the concrete walls. The sound of battle above them had intensified, with periodic explosions that shook dust from the ceiling and caused the overhead pipes to rattle ominously. They reached a stairwell that led to the main floor where Colonel Williams' office was located. Dr. Chen peered through the small window in the door, scanning for any signs of enemy movement. What she saw made her step back quickly. "There are at least 4 militants in the main corridor," she whispered to Sarah. "They're setting up some kind of equipment, probably communications gear or explosives." Sarah moved closer to the window and carefully observed the scene. The attackers were dressed in dark tactical gear and moved with the precision of trained soldiers. One of them was speaking into a radio in a language she didn't recognize, while the others worked on assembling what looked like a sophisticated electronic device. "They're jamming our communications," Sarah realized. "That's why we couldn't reach anyone on the radio. They're systematically cutting off our ability to coordinate a defense." Dr. Chen checked her watch. It's been almost an hour since the attack started. By now, external reinforcements should be mobilizing, but if the militants can maintain control of key buildings and communication systems, they can hold out for hours. As they watched, one of the militants pointed in their direction and started walking toward the stairwell. Sarah and Dr. Chen quickly backed away from the door and looked for alternative routes. There was another stairwell at the far end of the basement, but reaching it would require crossing an open area where they might be spotted. "Sarah, listen to me," Dr. Chen said urgently. "We need to split up. I'm going to create a distraction to draw them away from this area. You take the back stairwell and try to reach Colonel Williams or whoever's in command. The intelligence data you have could be crucial for understanding their objectives." Sarah shook her head. "I'm not leaving you. We can find another way." "This isn't a debate, Dr. Bruce," Chen replied firmly. "I'm your supervisor, and I'm giving you a direct order. Your job is to get that intelligence to our people, not to protect me. I've been in worse situations than this during my CIA days." Before Sarah could protest further, Dr. Chen pulled a small smoke grenade from her emergency kit. Sarah hadn't even known she carried such things. Dr. Chen smiled grimly at Sarah's surprised expression. "Old habits from my field operations days," she explained. "Now go. When you hear the distraction start, move fast and don't look back." Chen moved toward a different section of the basement, leaving Sarah alone with her laptop bag and the crucial intelligence data. Sarah's hands were shaking as she positioned herself near the back stairwell, waiting for Dr. Ford. Chen's signal. The explosion came sooner than expected. Dr. Chen had apparently triggered the building's fire suppression system in the main mechanical room, setting off alarms throughout the building and filling several corridors with foam and flashing lights. The militants in the main corridor shouted to each other and moved toward the disturbance, leaving their equipment momentarily unguarded. Sarah seized the opportunity and sprinted up the back stairwell. Her heels clicked loudly on the concrete steps, so she quickly removed her shoes and continued in her stocking feet. The first floor was in chaos, with emergency lights flashing and the fire suppression alarms adding to the cacophony of sounds from the ongoing battle. She reached Colonel Williams' office area only to find it empty and partially destroyed. Bullet holes scarred the walls, and several desks had been overturned. Papers were scattered everywhere, and there was broken glass from shattered windows. It was clear that this area had seen heavy fighting. Sarah tried the radio Dr. Chen had given her, but still got only static. The militants' jamming equipment was apparently very effective. She was on her own now, with no way to contact friendly forces and no clear idea of where to go next. Through the damaged windows, she could see smoke rising from multiple buildings across the base. The attack was more extensive than she had initially realized. This wasn't just a raid or a probe. It was a full-scale assault designed to capture and hold the entire installation. Sarah's analytical mind began working despite her fear. She thought about the intelligence she had discovered that morning and the patterns she had identified. The attackers had clearly spent months planning this operation, which meant they had specific objectives beyond simple destruction. She opened her laptop and quickly reviewed the intercepted communications she had analyzed earlier. Looking at them now, with the attack underway, new details became apparent. There were references to securing the vault, extracting the packages, and maintaining position for 72 hours. Sarah realized that the attackers weren't planning a quick strike. They intended to hold the base for 3 days while they accomplished some specific mission. The vault reference probably meant the base's secure storage facility where classified materials and sensitive equipment were kept. If she was right about their objectives, then the attackers would need to control key buildings and eliminate any personnel who might interfere with their operation. That meant they would be systematically hunting down everyone on the base, especially anyone with access to classified information. As a civilian contractor with security clearance, Sarah would definitely be on their target list. She needed to find a way to stay hidden while figuring out how to disrupt their operation or contact the outside world. Sarah moved carefully through the damaged office area, looking for anything that might be useful. In Colonel Williams' office, she found a base map that showed the locations of all major facilities, including the secure storage vault. She also discovered an emergency communication kit in a locked drawer that she managed to open using tools from Marcus's toolkit. The communication kit contained a satellite phone, but when she tried to use it, she got no signal. The militants were apparently jamming satellite communications as well as radio frequencies. They had clearly thought of everything. As Sarah studied the base map, she began to understand the tactical situation more clearly. The attackers had chosen their targets strategically. By controlling the main gate, the communication center, and the administrative building, they could isolate the base and prevent effective coordination of defensive efforts. But there were aspects of the base that might not be on their target list. The civilian contractor facilities like Building C were primarily administrative and didn't contain sensitive military equipment. The attackers might view them as low-priority targets, especially if they believed all civilian personnel had been evacuated or secured. Sarah made a decision that surprised her with its boldness. Instead of trying to hide or escape, she was going to return to Building C and use her knowledge of the facility to fight back. Her analytical skills had identified the threat that morning. Now she could use those same skills to understand the attackers' weaknesses and exploit them. The journey back to Building C was more dangerous now. Sarah had to move carefully through areas that might be under enemy observation. She stayed close to walls, used damaged vehicles for cover, and avoided open areas where she might be spotted. As she approached Building C, she could see that the militants had posted guards at the main entrance. 2 armed men in tactical gear stood watch while others moved equipment inside. Sarah recognized some of the equipment as electronic surveillance gear, probably being used to monitor communications and track the movements of base personnel. Sarah circled around to the back of the building, where the service areas and loading docks were located. This area was less heavily guarded, probably because the attackers considered it less strategically important. She was able to enter through a maintenance door that she had noticed during her earlier escape with Dr. Philip Chen. Inside the building, Sarah could hear voices and movement from the upper floors where the main offices were located. The militants were apparently searching through the civilian workspaces, probably looking for intelligence materials or computer equipment that might be useful for their operation. Sarah made her way to the basement level, where the building's main utility systems were located. Her plan was still forming, but she knew that her best chance of fighting back involved using her intelligence and knowledge of the building systems rather than trying to engage in direct combat. In the basement, she found exactly what she was looking for: the building's main electrical and communications distribution panels. Sarah had always been good with technical systems, and she had spent enough time in this building to understand how its various systems were interconnected. She opened her laptop and began accessing the building's computer network. Because the attack had happened so suddenly, many of the electronic systems were still running normally. The militants had focused on jamming external communications, but hadn't yet taken control of the internal building management systems. Sarah discovered that she could access security cameras throughout the building from her current location. This gave her a real-time view of where the militants were positioned and what they were doing. She counted at least 8 attackers inside Building C, with more potentially in other areas she couldn't observe. More importantly, she realized that she could control various building systems from the basement. The electrical distribution, fire suppression, elevator controls, and even the building's public address system were all accessible through the building management network. For the first time since the attack began, Sarah smiled. She was no longer just a victim trying to survive. She was about to become a very dangerous opponent. Using the security camera feeds, Sarah began mapping the positions and movements of the militants. They were conducting a systematic search of the building, working their way through each floor and office. Their leader appeared to be a tall man with a distinctive scar on his left cheek, who was coordinating their activities through hand signals and whispered radio communications. Sarah noticed that the militants had a predictable pattern to their search technique. They cleared each room methodically, posted guards at key locations, and communicated their progress regularly to their leader. This discipline was an advantage for them, but it also made their behavior predictable. Sarah began her counterattack with something subtle. She triggered a minor electrical fluctuation that caused lights to flicker on the second floor. The militants noticed but dismissed it as a result of damage from the baffle. When nothing else happened, they continued their search. 15 minutes later, Sarah cut power to a specific section of the 3rd floor, plunging the area where 4 militants were searching into complete darkness. She watched through the security cameras as they struggled with flashlights and tried to restore power. While they were distracted, she activated the fire suppression system in that area, filling the corridors with foam and making movement difficult. The militant leader was clearly frustrated by these incidents, but he still seemed to believe they were dealing with random system failures caused by battle damage. He hadn't yet realized that someone was actively sabotaging their operation from inside the building. Sarah's confidence was growing with each successful intervention. She was learning that her analytical skills translated well to tactical thinking. By observing patterns in the militants' behavior and understanding the building's systems, she could predict their actions and counter them effectively. But Sarah also realized that she couldn't rely on building systems alone. Eventually, the militants would locate the basement area where she was hiding, and then she would need to be prepared for direct confrontation. The woman who had arrived at work that morning as a data analyst was about to discover just how far she was willing to go to survive and protect her colleagues. The real fight was about to begin, and Sarah was no longer just defending herself. She was going on the attack. Sarah's hands moved swiftly across her laptop keyboard as she monitored the militants' positions through the building's security camera network. She had been systematically disrupting their operations for the past hour, and their leader was clearly becoming suspicious that these weren't random system failures. Through the camera feeds, she watched as the scarred leader gathered his team on the 2nd floor for what appeared to be a briefing. He was pointing to different areas of the building and assigning his men to new positions. Sarah realized that they were changing their tactics, probably to counter whatever was causing the electrical and system disruptions. Sarah's makeshift command center in the basement utility room had grown more sophisticated as she learned to use the building's systems. She had rigged several improvised alarm systems using motion sensors and door contacts that would alert her if anyone approached her location. Her laptop was connected to multiple building systems, giving her control over everything from lighting to ventilation to fire suppression. But she knew that her current strategy had limits. The militants were adapting to her interference, and eventually they would trace the problems back to their source. When that happened, she needed to be ready for direct confrontation. Sarah began preparing for that possibility by exploring the basement storage areas more thoroughly. She discovered that the building's maintenance department kept a surprising variety of tools and supplies in the basement. There were electrical supplies, cleaning chemicals, maintenance tools, and even some construction materials left over from recent renovations. Her analytical mind began seeing these ordinary items as potential weapons and tools. The cleaning chemicals could be mixed to create smoke screens or even explosive compounds if she could figure out the proper combinations. The electrical supplies could be used to create shock devices or to modify the building's power systems for defensive purposes. Sarah's first real test came sooner than expected. One of the militants had apparently been assigned to check the basement levels, and he was working his way systematically through each room and corridor. Sarah watched his progress through the security cameras, noting that he moved with professional skill and maintained constant radio contact with his team leader. She had perhaps 10 minutes before he reached her location in the utility room. Sarah quickly shut down her laptop and gathered the most essential items: her analysis data, the satellite phone, and a small toolkit she had assembled from materials in the basement. She also grabbed a container of industrial solvent and a handful of electrical components that she thought might be useful. The basement had multiple rooms and corridors, giving Sarah several options for movement, but she realized that simply hiding would only postpone the inevitable confrontation. If she wanted to survive and continue disrupting the attacker's operation, she needed to eliminate this threat permanently. Sarah had never hurt another person in her life, but as she crouched in the darkness listening to the militants' approaching footsteps, she understood that her previous life was over. The woman who had spent 3 years peacefully analyzing intelligence reports was gone. In her place was someone who would do whatever was necessary to survive and protect others. The militant entered the utility room with his weapon raised and a powerful flashlight sweeping the area. Sarah had positioned herself behind a large electrical panel where she couldn't be seen from the doorway. She watched as the man carefully examined her improvised workstation, noting the evidence of recent activity. He spoke quietly into his radio, reporting that someone had been using the basement utility systems and might still be in the area. Sarah could hear the scarred leader's response through the radio. "Find them and eliminate them. We cannot afford to have someone interfering with our operation." The militant began a more thorough search of the room, moving methodically from one area to another. Sarah realized that he would discover her hiding place within minutes. She gripped the container of industrial solvent tightly and prepared herself for what she knew she had to do. When the militant rounded the electrical panel and his flashlight beam found her, Sarah was ready. She threw the industrial solvent directly into his face, causing him to scream in pain and drop his weapon as he clutched at his burning eyes. Before he could recover or call for help, Sarah grabbed a heavy wrench from the floor and struck him across the head with all the force she could muster. The militant collapsed unconsciously to the concrete floor. Sarah stood over him for a moment, shaking from adrenaline and the realization of what she had just done. But there was no time for reflection. She quickly secured his weapon, radio, and tactical equipment, then used electrical cable to tie him up in case he regained consciousness. Sarah examined the assault rifle with growing confidence. During her college years, she had taken shooting lessons at a local range as a hobby, though she had never imagined she would need such skills in a life-or-death situation. The weapon was similar to civilian sporting rifles she had used, and she quickly figured out the basic operation. The militant's radio was providing a constant stream of communications between team members. Sarah listened carefully, trying to understand their current objectives and positions. Most of the communications were in English, though some tactical terms were spoken in what sounded like Russian or Eastern European language. From the radio chatter, Sarah learned that the militants had been searching for the intelligence analyst who had been disrupting their operation. They had apparently found evidence of her activities in various parts of the building and were now actively hunting for her. The scarred leader was coordinating a systematic sweep that would eventually cover every room in the building. Sarah realized that her advantage lay in mobility and her knowledge of the building's layout. The militants were searching as a coordinated team, but that coordination also made them predictable. If she could stay ahead of their search pattern and continue attacking their operation from unexpected angles, she might be able to eliminate them one by one. She strapped the assault rifle across her back and gathered additional equipment from the unconscious militant: extra ammunition, tactical vest, knife, and night vision goggles. The tactical vest was too large for her small frame, but she managed to adjust the straps to make it workable. Sarah's first priority was to continue disrupting the militants' communications and coordination. She made her way to a different part of the basement where the building's main communications equipment was housed. Using her laptop and the tools she had gathered, she began introducing systematic interference into their radio frequencies. The interference was subtle at first, just occasional static and dropped signals that could be attributed to equipment problems. But as Sarah learned more about their communication protocols, she was able to create more sophisticated disruptions. She began inserting false status reports, conflicting orders, and misleading position updates into their radio traffic. Through the security cameras, Sarah watched as the militants became increasingly frustrated and confused. Team members were reporting to positions that other team members claimed to have already cleared. Orders were being contradicted by other orders that seemed to come from their leadership. The disciplined coordination that had made them effective was beginning to break down. The scarred leader was clearly aware that their communications were being compromised, but he couldn't identify the source of the problem. Sarah watched him gather his remaining team members for another briefing, this time using hand signals instead of radio communications. Sarah counted 7 remaining militants in the building, not including the one she had incapacitated in the basement. They were now operating in pairs, using predetermined signals and maintaining visual contact instead of relying on radio communication. This made them less vulnerable to her electronic interference, but it also made them less flexible and slower to respond to changing situations. Sarah decided to escalate her tactics. Using the building's fire suppression system, she created a diversion on the first floor that drew 2 pairs of militants to investigate. While they were occupied with the false alarm, Sarah moved to the 3rd floor where the remaining militants were conducting their search. She positioned herself in an office area where she had a clear view of the corridor. When one pair of militants approached, Sarah activated the corridor's emergency lighting system, strobing bright lights that would temporarily blind anyone wearing night vision equipment. In the confusion that followed, she eliminated both militants with precise shots from her captured assault rifle. The sound of gunfire immediately alerted the other militants to her location. Sarah could hear them coordinating their response and moving to surround her position. But she was already moving, using her knowledge of the building's layout to stay ahead of their search pattern. Sarah had discovered that the building's air conditioning ducts were large enough for her to crawl through, giving her access to areas that the militants couldn't easily reach. She used this hidden network to move between floors and observe the attackers without being detected. From her position in the ventilation system, Sarah could overhear conversations between the militants as they regrouped and planned their next moves. She learned that their primary objective was indeed to capture the base's secure storage facility, and that they were operating under strict time constraints. They needed to complete their mission and evacuate within a specific time frame, probably before external military reinforcements arrived. Sarah also learned that there were additional militant teams operating in other buildings throughout the base. The group in Building C was just one part of a larger coordinated assault. This information made Sarah realize that her individual actions, while important for her own survival, were part of a much larger battle. But Sarah also understood something that the militants didn't. Her continued resistance and the elimination of their team members was disrupting their timeline and forcing them to divert resources from their primary objective. Every minute they spent hunting for her was a minute they weren't accomplishing their mission goals. Sarah decided to make that fact work in her favor. Instead of simply trying to survive, she was going to make herself such a persistent and dangerous threat that the militants would have no choice but to focus their full attention on eliminating her. While they were distracted by hunting her down, other defenders on the base would have opportunities to reorganize and counterattack. From the air conditioning duct, Sarah observed the scarred leader having an increasingly heated conversation with someone through a different radio, probably his command structure. She could only hear his side of the conversation, but it was clear that he was being pressured to complete his mission objectives more quickly. "The intelligence analyst is proving more resourceful than anticipated," he said in accented English. "She has already eliminated 3 of my team members and is disrupting our entire operation. I need authorization to bring additional resources to bear." The response from his command apparently wasn't what he wanted to hear, because his expression grew darker. "Understood. We will complete the mission as planned, but I am documenting this delay for the record." Sarah smiled grimly as she listened to this exchange. The woman they were hunting was no longer the same person who had arrived at work that morning as a routine data analyst. She had become someone far more dangerous than they had anticipated, and she was just getting started. The remaining militants had no idea what they were really dealing with. Sarah's analytical mind was now fully focused on tactical problems, and she was learning to be very good at solving them. The hunter had indeed become the hunted, but the roles were about to reverse again. Sarah crawled through the ventilation system with growing confidence, her movements now silent and precise. The ductwork gave her access to nearly every part of the building while remaining invisible to the militants below. Through the metal grates, she could observe their positions and overhear their increasingly frustrated communications. The scarred leader had reorganized his remaining team into a single group of 5 militants, abandoning their previous strategy of working in pairs. Sarah recognized this as both a strength and a weakness. Working together made them more difficult to attack directly, but it also made them slower and less flexible in their search patterns. Sarah had spent the last hour studying the building's layout from her unique vantage point in the ductwork. She had identified several tactical advantages that the militants weren't aware of. The building's emergency lighting system could be controlled from multiple locations, the fire suppression system could be triggered in specific zones, and there were several structural weak points where she could create obstacles or diversions. But more importantly, Sarah had been listening to the militants' radio communications and had begun to understand their broader mission. They weren't just trying to capture the base's secure storage facility. They were specifically looking for classified research data related to new military communication systems that were being developed at Fort Braxton. This information changed Sarah's understanding of the situation completely. If the militants succeeded in capturing that research data, it could compromise military operations worldwide. The stakes were much higher than she had initially realized, and her individual resistance was potentially preventing a major intelligence breach. Sarah decided to escalate her tactics even further. Instead of simply defending herself and disrupting the militants' operation, she was going to actively hunt them down and eliminate the entire team. The analytical part of her mind calculated the risks and determined that this was the optimal strategy for preventing their mission success. From her position in the ventilation system, Sarah observed the militants conducting another systematic search of the second floor. They moved in a tight formation, covering each other's movements and maintaining constant visual contact. Their discipline was impressive, but Sarah had identified patterns in their behavior that she could exploit. The militants always cleared rooms in the same sequence, always posted the same person as rear guard, and always used the same hand signals for communication. This predictability was going to be their downfall. Sarah positioned herself above a corridor intersection where she knew the militants would pass based on their search pattern. She had spent 30 minutes preparing this ambush, using materials from the building's maintenance supplies to create multiple layers of attack. First, she had rigged the corridor's sprinkler system to release a mixture of water and cleaning chemicals that would create a slippery surface and reduce visibility. Second, she had modified the electrical system to create a controlled power surge that would disable any electronic equipment in the area. Finally, she had positioned several improvised explosive devices made from cleaning supplies and electrical components. When the militants entered the corridor, Sarah triggered her sequence of attacks with precise timing. The chemical mixture from the sprinklers caused immediate disorientation and made movement difficult. The electrical surge disabled their radio equipment and night vision gear. The improvised explosives created chaos and panic while also blocking their retreat route. In the confusion that followed, Sarah dropped from the ventilation system directly into the middle of the militant formation. Her assault rifle was ready, and she moved with purpose that surprised even herself. The woman who had never been in combat was fighting like a trained soldier. 3 militants went down before the remaining 2 could react effectively. Sarah rolled behind an overturned desk for cover as return fire filled the air around her. But she had chosen her position carefully, and the militants were trapped in an area with limited cover and no easy escape routes. Sarah used her superior knowledge of the building layout to outmaneuver the remaining militants. She knew which walls could be shot through, which areas had blind spots, and which routes would allow her to change position without being detected. The militants were fighting in an environment where every advantage belonged to their opponent. The 4th militant fell when Sarah used the building's public address system to mask the sound of her movement, allowing her to get behind him while he was focused on her last known position. The 5th and final team member, the scarred leader himself, proved more challenging. The leader had apparently recognized that conventional tactics weren't working against Sarah. Instead of trying to hunt her down, he barricaded himself in a defensible position and tried to re-establish contact with his command structure. Sarah could see him through the security camera system as he worked frantically with damaged radio equipment. Sarah realized that she couldn't allow him to report the failure of his mission or call for reinforcements. If additional militant teams were redirected to Building C, she would be overwhelmed despite her tactical advantages. She needed to eliminate him quickly and permanently. But the leader had chosen his defensive position well. He was in a room with only one entrance, good cover, and clear sight lines to prevent any direct assault. Sarah would need to be creative to reach him without exposing herself to fatal risk. Sarah returned to the basement and retrieved additional supplies from the maintenance areas. She had a plan that would require precise timing and considerable risk, but it was the only way to eliminate the final threat without allowing him to communicate with his command. Using the building's plumbing system, Sarah began flooding specific areas of the second floor where the leader was positioned. The water would eventually reach the electrical systems in that area, creating safety hazards that would force him to move to a less defensible position. While the flooding progressed, Sarah used the ventilation system to position herself above the leader's location. Through the ductwork, she could hear him speaking urgently into his radio equipment, apparently trying multiple frequencies to re-establish communication with his command. Sarah listened carefully to his side of the conversation as he finally made contact with someone in authority. What she heard made her blood run cold. Building C is compromised, the leader reported. The target has been eliminated by a single defender. Request immediate extraction and implementation of Contingency Protocol 7. Sarah didn't know what Contingency Protocol 7 entailed, but the leader's tone suggested it was something drastic. If the militants couldn't complete their mission as planned, they apparently had alternative methods for achieving their objectives or covering their retreat. The leader continued his radio communication. Affirmative. Understood. Initiating building destruction sequence now. All evidence will be eliminated as planned. Sarah realized with growing horror that the militants had apparently planted explosives throughout the building as part of their operation. If they couldn't steal the intelligence data they were after, they were going to destroy it along with anyone who might have accessed it. That included Sarah and her analytical work that had first identified their operation. The leader was now moving toward what appeared to be a control device for the explosive charges. Sarah could see him through the security cameras as he began entering codes into an electronic device that was undoubtedly connected to demolition charges placed throughout the building. Sarah knew she had perhaps minutes before the explosives were triggered. She couldn't reach the leader's position in time to stop him through conventional means, but she still had one advantage he didn't know about. Her access to the building's systems gave her control over more than just lights and sprinklers. Sarah quickly accessed the building's main power distribution system and began routing massive amounts of electrical current to specific circuits near the leader's position. The electrical overload would cause cables to burn out and potentially start fires, but it would also create electromagnetic interference that might disrupt his explosive control device. The plan worked better than Sarah had hoped. The electrical surge not only disrupted the leader's device, but also caused a significant fire in the room where he was positioned. Emergency sprinklers activated automatically, but the combination of electrical fires and flooding water created dangerous conditions that forced him to abandon his defensive position. As the leader emerged from the damaged room, Sarah was waiting for him. She had positioned herself in the corridor, with clear sight lines and superior cover. The final confrontation was brief but decisive. Sarah stood over the leader's body and examined the explosive control device he had been using. The display showed that charges were planted in 6 different locations throughout the building, with a timer that had been set for 30 minutes. The device appeared to be damaged by the electrical surge, but Sarah couldn't be certain that the explosives had been disarmed. She gathered all the radio equipment and weapons from the eliminated militants and began trying to contact base security or external military forces. Most frequencies were still jammed, but she eventually found an emergency channel that seemed to be clear. "This is Sarah Martinez, civilian contractor in Building C," she transmitted. "I have eliminated a militant infiltration team and discovered explosive devices planted throughout the building. Requesting immediate bomb disposal assistance and extraction." The response came from Colonel Williams himself, though his voice was strained and filled with background noise from ongoing battles. "Martinez, this is Williams. Are you certain about the explosive devices?" "We have teams engaged across the entire base and cannot spare bomb disposal personnel at this time." "Sir, I'm looking at the control device now," Sarah replied. "There are charges in 6 locations with approximately 25 minutes remaining on the timer. I'm going to attempt to locate and disarm them myself." There was a long pause before Colonel Williams responded. "Martinez, do not attempt that yourself. Evacuate the building immediately and get to a safe distance. That's a direct order." Sarah looked around at the office building where she had worked peacefully for 3 years. In the computers and files around her was intelligence data that could be crucial for preventing future attacks. If the building was destroyed, that information would be lost forever. "Sir, with respect, I cannot comply with that order," Sarah replied. "There's too much critical intelligence here to abandon. I'm going to attempt to disarm the explosives." Sarah had never disarmed a bomb in her life, but she had been analyzing technical systems for years. Explosive devices were just another type of system with predictable components and logical connections. Her analytical skills had already proven useful in tactical situations. Now she would test them against a different type of technical challenge. The timer showed 23 minutes remaining as Sarah began her search for the first explosive device. She was racing against time, but for the first time since the attack began, she felt completely confident in her abilities. The woman who had started the day as a routine data analyst had discovered capabilities she never knew she possessed. Sarah was no longer just surviving. She was winning. Sarah moved through Building C with methodical precision, using the damage control device to guide her search for the explosive charges. The device's display showed the approximate locations of each bomb, though the electrical damage had made some of the readings unclear. She had 20 to 3 minutes to find and disarm 6 devices hidden throughout a 3-story building. The first explosive device was located in the basement near the main electrical panels, exactly where Sarah had been conducting her initial resistance operations. The bomb was a sophisticated military-grade device with multiple redundant firing mechanisms, but Sarah approached it like any other technical problem that needed analysis and solution. She photographed the device from multiple angles with her phone, documenting the wiring patterns and component connections. Her years of analyzing technical systems had taught her to look for logical patterns even in unfamiliar equipment. Explosive devices followed the same basic principles as other electronic systems: power source, trigger mechanism, and payload activation. Sarah identified what appeared to be the main power connection and carefully traced the wiring to find potential disarming points. She had no formal training in bomb disposal, but her analytical mind could see the logical structure of the device. After 10 careful minutes of examination, she located what appeared to be a manual disarm switch hidden behind a protective cover. The first device went silent, with an almost anticlimactic click. Sarah checked the control device and confirmed that one of the 6 indicators had changed from red to green. 5 devices remaining, with 13 minutes on the timer. The second explosive was hidden in a supply closet on the first floor. This device was different from the first one, suggesting that the militants had used multiple types of bombs to ensure that disarming one wouldn't provide information about the others. Sarah spent precious minutes studying the new configuration before attempting to disarm it. This bomb required a different approach. Instead of a manual disarm switch, it appeared to have a coded sequence that needed to be entered into a small keypad. Sarah examined the keypad carefully, looking for wear patterns or other clues about the correct sequence. She noticed that 4 specific numbers showed more wear than the others: 2, 4, 7, and 9. Sarah tried several combinations before realizing that the sequence might be related to the militant's operational timeline. She entered the date of the attack in military format 2479. The device beeped twice and went silent. 2 down, 4 to go, with 8 minutes remaining. The third bomb was located on the second floor in the area where Sarah had fought the militant team earlier. The device was partially damaged by the chemical and electrical attacks she had used during the battle, but the explosives themselves appeared to still be functional. Sarah could see that some of the wiring had been severed during the fighting, which might have inadvertently disabled parts of the firing mechanism, but she couldn't be certain without a more detailed examination, and time was running dangerously short. Instead of trying to understand the damaged wiring, Sarah decided to physically remove the explosive charges from the firing mechanism. Using tools from her improvised toolkit, she carefully separated the plastic explosives from the electronic components that would trigger detonation. It was crude but effective. The third device was neutralized with 4 minutes to spare. The fourth explosive device was hidden in the building's main communications room. Sarah found it attached directly to the servers and networking equipment that handled the building's computer systems. This bomb was designed not just to destroy the building, but to specifically eliminate any digital intelligence that might be stored in the computer networks. Sarah realized that this device was probably the most important one to disarm. If it exploded, years of analytical work and classified intelligence would be destroyed, even if she managed to save the building itself. But the device was also the most sophisticated one she had encountered, with multiple backup systems and anti-tampering measures. With less than 3 minutes remaining, Sarah made a desperate decision. Instead of trying to disarm the device properly, she began rapidly downloading as much data as possible from the computer servers to her laptop. If she couldn't save the servers themselves, she could at least preserve the most critical intelligence files. As her laptop worked to copy terabytes of data, Sarah examined the bomb more carefully. She realized that the device was designed to detect tampering and would explode immediately if she made a mistake. But she also noticed that it was connected to the building's main power system, probably to ensure reliable operation even if backup batteries failed. Sarah used her access to the building's electrical systems to cut power to the communications room while the laptop was still running on battery power. The bomb's display went dark, and several warning lights began flashing on the device itself. Sarah held her breath, waiting to see if the power loss would trigger an immediate detonation. Nothing happened. The device appeared to have shut down safely when it lost external power. Sarah quickly disconnected the bomb from its mounting brackets and carried it to a reinforced storage room where any accidental explosion would be contained. 4 devices neutralized, 2 remaining. The 5th explosive was located on the 3rd floor, in Colonel Williams's office area, where Sarah had first discovered the extent of the attack. She found the device hidden inside a filing cabinet that contained classified operational plans. Like the communications room bomb, this device was specifically targeted at destroying intelligence materials. But when Sarah examined the control device's timer, she saw that she had less than 90 seconds remaining. There was no time for careful analysis or methodical disarmament. She needed to act immediately based on her best understanding of the device's construction. Sarah identified what appeared to be the main power connection and simply cut the wires with metal snips from her toolkit. The device made several beeping sounds and then went silent. The control device showed 5 green lights and 1 remaining red indicator. 1 explosive device left, with 45 seconds on the timer. According to the control device, the final bomb was located somewhere in the basement, but Sarah had already searched most of the basement areas while disarming the first device. She ran down the stairs, following the device's directional indicator toward the source of the final explosive. The indicator led her to an area she hadn't thoroughly examined, a utility room that housed the building's main gas lines and heating systems. Sarah realized with growing horror that this final bomb wasn't just designed to destroy the building. It was positioned to rupture gas lines and create a massive explosion that would level several surrounding buildings as well. 20 seconds remaining. The gas line bomb was the largest and most complex device Sarah had encountered. It had multiple redundant systems and appeared to be designed to resist disarming attempts. But Sarah also noticed something that gave her hope. The device was connected to the building's gas pressure monitoring system, probably to ensure maximum explosive effect. Sarah located the main gas shutoff valve for the building and turned it completely closed. The gas pressure in the lines began dropping immediately, and she could hear the hissing sound of gas escaping from various connections throughout the system. 10 seconds remaining. Sarah grabbed the bomb and ran toward the building's loading dock area, where there was a large dumpster that might contain any explosion. She threw the device into the dumpster and sprinted away from the area as fast as she could. 5 seconds. 4, 3, 2. The explosion was smaller than Sarah had expected. With the gas pressure reduced, the bomb had destroyed itself but hadn't created the massive chain reaction the militants had planned. Sarah was thrown to the ground by the shockwave, and debris rained down around her. But she was alive and conscious. Sarah lay on the concrete floor for several minutes, listening to the silence. For the first time in hours, there were no gunshots, no explosions, and no radio chatter from hunting militants. The immediate threat was over. She activated her radio and contacted Colonel Williams again. "Sir, this is Martinez. All explosive devices have been neutralized. Building C is secure." The response came immediately. "Martinez, confirm your status. Are you injured? Are there any remaining hostile forces in your area?" "Sir, I'm operational and uninjured. All militants in Building C have been eliminated. I have secured weapons, radio equipment, and intelligence materials from the attackers. I also have data downloads from the building's computer systems." There was a long pause before Colonel Williams responded, and Sarah could hear multiple voices in the background discussing her situation. "Martinez, maintain your current position. We're sending a security team to your location for extraction and debriefing. Do not leave the building until they arrive." Sarah spent the next 20 minutes securing the building and gathering evidence from the eliminated militants. She collected their weapons, radio equipment, identification documents, and any intelligence materials they had been carrying. Her analytical mind was already working to understand the broader implications of what had happened. When the military security team finally arrived at Building C, they found Sarah sitting calmly in the main lobby, surrounded by weapons and equipment she had gathered from 20 eliminated militants. Her clothing was torn and dirty, her hair was disheveled, and there were minor cuts and bruises on her arms and face. But her eyes were clear and focused, and she greeted the security team with a professional briefing on what she had discovered. "Ma'am," said the team leader, a young sergeant who was clearly struggling to process what he was seeing. "Are you saying you eliminated all these hostiles yourself?" "That's correct, Sergeant," Sarah replied matter-of-factly. "I've documented their equipment and any intelligence materials they were carrying. I believe this was part of a larger coordinated attack, and the information they gathered could be crucial for understanding the overall operation." The sergeant looked around at the evidence of intense fighting throughout the building, then back at the small, professional woman who was calmly discussing tactical analysis.
"Ma'am, with respect, you're a civilian contractor."
"How did you—" Sarah smiled for the first time since the attack had begun. "Sergeant, I analyze threats for a living. Today I just had to do it more directly than usual. Over the following weeks, as military investigators reconstructed the events of the attack on Fort Braxton, They would struggle to understand how a single civilian contractor had not only survived a coordinated military assault, but had single-handedly eliminated an entire militant infiltration team and prevented the destruction of critical intelligence materials. Sarah Martinez had arrived at work that morning as a quiet data analyst who processed intelligence reports from the safety of an office. She left that evening as someone who had redefined what civilian contractors were capable of in a crisis situation. The woman who had discovered the threat that morning through pattern analysis had ended the day by becoming the solution to that threat through tactical action. Sarah had proven that courage and intelligence could be just as powerful as military training when the stakes were high enough and the motivation was strong enough. The militants had planned their operation for months, accounting for every defensive measure and contingency the base might employ. But they had never planned for someone like Sarah Martinez. They had expected to face soldiers and security personnel. Instead, they had encountered someone who could think like an analyst, fight like a soldier, and adapt like a survivor. In the end, the greatest threat to their carefully planned operation hadn't been the base's military defenders or its sophisticated security systems. It had been a civilian contractor who refused to be a victim and discovered that she was capable of far more than anyone, including herself, had ever imagined. Sarah Martinez had started the day as just another person working on a military base. She ended it as a legend who would be studied and remembered for years to come. The woman who had fought back and won against impossible odds had proven that sometimes the most dangerous opponent is the one you never see coming.